the title, but this is the most striking image. This is not AI generated. This is a photograph that was circulated amongst soldiers in 2019. It actually comes from this article on the Daily Mail from 2019. Here is this undoctored image of a active component soldier in the British Army, and just not the only embarrassment to our army, my first army. This is another one. This was actually one of the ladies in uniform lecturing other soldiers on how to be healthy. Fatness is a problem that's been going back. Yeah, I am shaming. I am fat shaming these women, and they should be. If you're going to join an army, uh, being fat is going to be a problem, and should be a disqualifier. One of my American friends looked at this photograph and said, "Well, what? Why? How did she even find a uniform that could fit that?" That's a good question. At the point where your uniform has to be stitched together, as is alleged in this meme, maybe you should be disqualified from being a soldier. Uh, Even if you're being granted special privileges on the physical fitness test. But it's not about the British Army. It's not about women in particular. It's about how the British military is shrinking in size. That's the quantity, and they're declining in quality. The personnel are declining in quality, and there's several reasons for that, several measures of that I want to get into. So I'm going to frame the video discussion of this in a different way to the way I stacked it. The British military is becoming smaller, more contractual. It's relying too much on contractors, which is damaging the corporate cohesion of the military, its corporate brand, and also the corporate cohesion in the sense that personnel are being managed, recruited, trained, educated, and managed as personnel by contractors who do not have the inside the military, incorporate sensibilities, and they are less competent, and they are less conducive to recruiting and retention. So I haven't even finished the list here. British military is becoming smaller, more contractual, that's number two, slower and less personal, in part because it's more contractual, like the processing of personnel. The process of managing personnel is becoming slower and less personal, and that is a problem for recruiting and retention, and also for the quality of promotions, etc. It's becoming woker, which means people are getting selected as recruits and being promoted on the basis of their identities, their demographics, and on their compliance with woke identity politics. So I keep getting into items on the list without finishing the list because it just gets me so agitated. Okay, the list. British military is becoming smaller, more contractual, slower and less personal, woker. I'm only 4 items into the list. Foreign, as in the military is recruiting more foreigners to replace the Britons that the system is driving out or failing to recruit. More female, based on a quota. I'm going to discuss this. There's nothing wrong with having foreigners of a certain type, ones that have a loyalty and English language skills, which increasingly foreign recruits do not have. There's nothing wrong with having females compete equally with males. Again, I'm getting into the gist of it because I can foresee the knee-jerk reactions to me even identifying the items on the list, even by saying there is the military is becoming increasingly female in ways that are not best for the military. I'm having to qualify what I mean. I can't finish the list. All right, the list is British military is becoming smaller, more contractual, slower and less personal, woker, it's number 4, more foreign, 5, more female, 6, fatter, 7, as I've just shown you some illustrative images, emotionally sensitive, there's more snowflakes, and I'll explain why, and non-combative, and by that I mean the combatants are more likely to leave, in part because of the woke messaging, but also the risk of uh, legal, both civil and criminal prosecution in Britain, including by the British government, if you are accused of an illegal killing or denying somebody the right to their human right to life in the process of combat, even if you follow the rules of engagement. And these prosecutions can be retrospective. So that's making soldiering or any military occupational specialty that is combative, it's making that riskier in a legal sense, even in addition to its physical risks. And so you've got a disproportionate incentive for combatants to leave the military, and that's making the military less combatant. And it's helping to explain why a minority of the military is ready for deployment. How long did it take me to finish that list? Right, I'm going to have to reread the list because what was it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 trends that I was trying to identify in this Substack. The British military is becoming smaller, more contractual, slower and less personal, woker, more foreign, female, fat, emotionally sensitive, and non-combative. Hang on, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right. So let's appreciate the military is getting smaller. More personnel are leaving than joining Britain's military. It's already under authorized strength. It's under its target restorative strength. That for years, the government has failed to meet its authorized strength. More are leaving than joining, and those that leave overrepresent the best of personnel because those are the ones that, for instance, have more opportunities outside of the military. And they're also, as I'll show you, they're more likely to get pissed off by the woke messaging um, than the least capable personnel. So you get a personnel body which overrepresents the lowest capacity personnel, even before you make combatant roles more risky in law. So the scale of the problem, as I substacked, as of the new fiscal year in Britain, that was 1st of April, the armed forces held 6% fewer personnel than authorized. So that's pushing 9,000 fewer personnel. In the summer of this year, the government announced an increased target for applications, but that is just to fill current shortfalls. It's not to grow the authorized strength. This is true across all the services. Britain recognizes 3. There is a space command, but that's not recognized as a service. So there's the Navy is, first of all, it's failed to meet its recruitment goals every year since 2010. It currently runs a shortfall of 8%. That's the Navy and the Royal Marines. Collectively, shortfall of 8%. The RAF runs a shortfall of 13%. It is especially short of pilots, which is a bit of a problem when you're in Air Force. Such a problem, it's short of instructors for those pilots too. So it hires Indian Air Force pilots to train British pilots. The Army has more than halved in personnel since 1975. It counted less than 71,000 soldiers in June of this year. The target then was 73,000. The government has talked about finding a budget for a higher target by a few thousand more. That would I'm going to estimate as if the recruiting works, and it's not going to, according to my findings in the rest of the Substack. the army would probably get to 76,000. Most of them are not ready for deployment. So, a recent estimate is that at best, the army might be able to generate a single division for overseas deployment of about 30,000 troops. Most of those would not be combatants, even within the 30,000 troops. It have a huge logistical tail. All right, compare Germany. It sustains 2 armored divisions in peacetime. Britain does not sustain one. It claims the capacity to stand up a single division in war. There's doubts that it can even do that. Germany's armed forces are growing while Britain's are shrinking. Germany aims for 460,000 active and reserve personnel by 2035. British forces held 181,890 personnel at the start of this fiscal year. Germany aims to add 80,000 personnel by 2035. Britain aims to add a few thousand within an indefinite period. Probably won't be budgeted this fiscal year because of the austerity of this government, because of its overspending in other areas, and the traditional, as in traditional over the last few decades, governmental inattention to defense, and I should say the MOD's waste of its money. It wastes its money on failed acquisitions in particular, and it's wasting money on failed recruiting campaigns, which is within the scope here. So we'll focus on that. Now, Germany is expanding because it's worried about the Russian threat, but Britain can't avoid that threat either. Britain has deployed on Russia's borders. It has primary responsibility for the northern flank. It has troops in the Baltics, ground troops. It leads a NATO brigade in the Baltics, and it has pilots, for instance, in Romania. And then it has its wider international commitments, wider than Germany's international commitments, and yet it's running a military which is 2.5 times smaller. So now, by the way, so what's the government's explanation for all this? It says, it's the previous administration's fault, which is true to some extent. The Conservative administrations, despite them being conservative, have tended to starve the Ministry of Defense, and they've gone pretty woke so this woke trend in recruiting precedes the current administration, but the current administration has been in office for more than a year and a half. It hasn't improved the recruiting, and it hasn't repudiated the wokeness in the MOD, as I shall explain. Its other explanation for the shortfalls is a strengthening civilian job market, which is a bit of a joke because we still have rising unemployment, particularly in the youth demographics from which the military primarily recruits. So what went wrong? Right, first of all, the MOD passed to contractors most of its recruiting and its training and education. This started under the Blair administration in the 1990s, and I had a first-hand seat. Is that the right phrase? I had a first row seat. That's it. First row seat to some of that, such as at the Defense Academy in the 2000s, where the contracted education just got more expensive and lower in quality, and was too much about history and not enough about staff skills, for instance. I can digress on that. That would be worth another video, actually. You're passing that to contractors who have lower incentives. They have essentially economic incentives. And in a Ministry of Defense, which traditionally is very bad at supplier relationship management, very weak, and tends to let schedules slide and let budgets overrun. Right, this hasn't worked out well. So a good example is the Army's recruiting. The Army passed recruiting to Capita in 2012. 10 years later, Parliament found that Capita's performance was, quote, abysmal. The Army's management of Capita was weak. Quote, The Army and Capita also failed to simplify the recruitment approach and have only recently introduced the essential online recruitment system over 4 years late. So that was 10 years into the contract. This year, the government announced that by 2027, recruitment for all the armed forces will be handled by a single contracted service. So you've already had failures of centralized contracting on a service by service basis. Now you're just going to make it more centralized. Now, it is true, centralization offers efficiencies, but historically, it has also tended to become more expensive because, for one reason, as I mentioned earlier, the incentives are lower for efficiency. If you're a contractor, you're just trying to milk the system. You're not within the system mindful of, if you take more resources, there'll be less resources to go elsewhere in the military. Your military, it's not your military if you're a contractor, it's just a purse from which you try to extract as much resources as possible. Again, I have an ethos here. I've seen this firsthand. For instance, at the Defense Academy, as an educator, seeing bad contracts, badly written contracts being executed by people who didn't care. Not me. I wasn't. I cared. I've written a book about this, right? It's Made Not Born. I'll post a link to it. Um, a, a book about comparing centralization versus decentralization in personnel management. A regiment, some of the argument is obvious. A regiment has more incentive to recruit and train good personnel than a contractor does at a huge level, such as the entire military. There's going to be a single contracted service for recruiting for the entire military. That's insane. You're destroying the regimental system, which has been so effective at building unit cohesion because it has the incentives to recruit and train and manage at the unit level in an effective way. The government's destroying the regimental system. Okay, so contractualism, that's the first problem. Second, related to contractualism, advertising went woke. Now, the military is traditionally advertised for people who want to challenge, to travel, to defend Britain. They're patriotic. They don't want to live a desk jockey life. They want to be active. They want to be challenged. That was all. That was the advertising when I was recruited. By the early 2010s, the banner was "Be the best." Now, recruiting gets contracted out. In the Army's case, 2012. By the mid 2010s, adverts were captioned, "This is belonging." Okay, that sort of speaks to the camaraderie and the cohesion that attracts people into the military and keeps them there. But that's not what the adverts were focusing on. They were focused on people getting in touch with their feelings. So I remember one advert, I think this was getting into the late 2010s. One advert had a soldier sitting on his butt in the forest crying a little tear as he read a letter, and then his mates sort of help him get over that with a bit of banter or something. It's actually unclear. There isn't much script in it. Yeah, okay. But that's, by the way, that's also how the government was recruiting teachers at the time. Banter. It's not really why you get into teaching, but okay. It shouldn't be the primary way you recruit teachers. You're going to get banter with your pupils. You shouldn't really be getting soldiers um, into the military by saying you can shed a tear in the field. All right, there's other messaging that I'll get into, which is clearly too much emo and not enough focused on the traditional challenges and skills of soldiering. And there's another advert, it's more infamous. I spent more time on it in the Substack. There's some soldiers in the video, there's some soldiers on patrol, and then suddenly they stop so that one of them can pray. And this soldier pulls out a prayer rug and a prayer cap and goes down, and the rest of them are sitting around on rocks, waiting. And that's supposed to be, this is belonging. No, it's completely unprofessional. And it's also unnecessary, even if you're Muslim, because the Quran permits the suspension of religious obligations during military operations. So it's pandering. It's pandering. It's not even effective recruiting. Clearly, it's not working. Just so you know, the current banner is "You belong here." So Capita, which got slammed by Parliament for doing a bad job, its big change was to shift the banner from "This is belonging" to "You belong here." That was its major change. Capita, by the way, it claims that this language is appealing to the majority who don't think the army is for them. You don't need to appeal to the majority. You shouldn't appeal to the majority. The majority can't hack military service. You don't want non-patriots. You don't want lazy asses who spend their time on video games thinking to themselves, I could have been a soldier if I wanted. You don't want those people. You don't want the majority. You don't want average. You want the minority who have the incentives, the intrinsic incentives and the capacity, the physical capacity, and a lot of rare things that go together into somebody who's both has the capacity and the motivation to make a career out of it. Because if people make a career out of it, it's less costly for you. You have less turnover. It's less costly for you, the government. So the incentives behind Capita's recruiting campaign are wrong. They're wrong in the first place. It's appealing to the majority. No, that's wrong. Actually, make the army seem like a challenging and rewarding career instead of for unprofessionals who need to pray during a patrol. See, I get worked up again. All right, number 3, contractors are slower and less personal. They're less personal, two close words there. They're slower and less personal at processing applications. So contractors, remember, I said they have a different incentive structure. It's economic. And if they can get away with a piss poor job, they're going to get away with it. And they're not going to process applications particularly quickly. Well done, Army, for um, outsourcing what you should have kept in-house. So here's some interesting data. In the 10 years from 2014 through 2023, 3/4 of applicants to the military withdrew. 3/4. Why? Because most of them waited more than 6 months. So the latest report I've got is that the median wait times, the median wait time is the very middle one. So you're going to have about 50%, nearly 50%, almost 50% of applications waiting less and 50% waiting more than 8 months. That's the median wait time. It's not an average. 8 months to wait between making an application and getting a decision. In that time, the applicants could find other work, or they get the sense that the MOD is a haven for bad management by under incentivized contractors. So why do I want to join the military? So most withdraw. Most applicants withdraw while they're waiting to be inducted into the military under a contractual system. All right, that was number 3. Number 4, British military are increasingly foreign. It's actually more than 1 in 10 now. Military personnel are foreign nationals in the British military. Why? Because legitimately, you're having a problem recruiting Britons. That's fixable, in my opinion. But okay, imagine it's not fixable. Maybe, the economy is so strong that it's difficult to hire Britons into the military. That's not true. The economy is still bad. It should be easy to get young people into military. But you're just pissing them off with woke recruiting and bad mismanaged recruiting. But anyway, the real reason the MOD or the government as a whole wants more foreigners is it's easier to satisfy them with the pay and benefits on offer, and they add to the diversity quotient. Like, that's all. Diversity is a good thing in theory. unless you allow it to be to become unmeritorious and you turn a blind eye to the negative side effects. One of the negative side effects you should expect is that foreigners are going to be less patriotic, less incentivized. And that's true, unfortunately. In the good old days, when we had a lot of foreigners in the military, they were Anglophones from South Africa, the Republic of Ireland, Australia, New Zealand sometimes. There were people who already spoke English and they often had a British heritage. Then you had certain foreigners who were, for historical reasons, um, directly recruited from abroad, Gurkhas and Fijians, for instance. And their recruiting pipeline is very well established. They integrate easily. And they tend to be highly competitive because there tend to be a lot more applicants than you can accept. So those foreigners tend to make good personnel. However, what I've learned in researching this problem this year is that it seems that most foreign applicants can't speak English adequately. They're not Anglophone, or certainly English is not their first language. They're economically motivated, and some of them are joining the military after the expiration or just before the expiration of their work or student study visas. So they are essentially economically motivated. The cap. So I said 1 in 10, more than 1 in 10 of the military. It's actually difficult to get the government to admit what the true proportion is. It could be as high as 12% over the whole military by some calculations. Yeah, I'm just going by estimates that have been released in Parliament instead of an honest breakdown of the nationality of all military personnel, which is what one would expect from an open government, but we don't have an open government in Britain. So let's say it's 12%. Well, in the combatant arms, the proportion seems to be higher. And that goes to the other point I was going to get to later, is that Britons are less and less willing to serve in the combatant arms when they're more likely to face legal recrimination for combat. So that is to segue into the point that the MOD sets a cap of 15% of personnel in a unit. But it's been reported in London Central Garrison, the proportion is 35%. So more than a third foreign nationals in a garrison which has high responsibilities for homeland security. So London has a lot of terrorism. The military has a secondary role in coming to the aid of civil powers during an emergency such as terrorism, but not just terrorism. It could be a natural disaster, such as a severe storm. The report is that 40% of those foreigners in London Central Garrison have been assessed as not speaking enough English to be safely employable in support of civil powers in an emergency. So they'd have to be left in garrison? I suppose so. And people will suffer. There'll be less personnel to actually help with the victims of that emergency. I've got another example of complaints about foreigners in the recruiting towards the combatant arms. So there's an infantry training centre in Catterick, Yorkshire, which is a separate problem. I don't want to get into it. Again, it speaks to centralisation. Instead of having regiments train, the infantry regiments train their infantry, or all the guards regiments train guards infantry. You've got an infantry training center. It's a highly centralized way of doing it. Actually, maybe even more centralized later. Don't agree with this centralization. I've written on the advantages of the regimental system. I resent the centralization, but go read the book. So in 2024, non-commissioned officer instructors at the infantry training center got together and wrote to the commander of the household division, because they were mostly guards, so they're worried about the supply to the household division, to warn that too many foreigners don't speak English well enough to be considered safe on live fire ranges. Too many have quote half-hearted allegiance to king and country. Too many joined to quote secure visa extensions. Did the MOD take them seriously? No. An army spokesman said the NCOs, are falling short of the army's values and standards. So that would be the woke standards. If they are falling short of the DEI officers' expectations, those should not be the army's values and standards. The army's values and standards should still be meritorious. So we should be assessing people on whether they speak English well enough, which segues into number 5. So the other problem with the British military's quality is there's a quota. There's actually a quota for increasing the number of women in the military. It's not meritorious to have quotas. I have argued women should compete with men to the same standards. And if they pass those standards, they should go into any role for which they have passed the standards. There is no need to restrict roles to men or women if they are competing equally to the same standards. However, I'm going to add a caveat. There is a justification to keep combat units one gender or the other. You don't want to add pre-deployment romantic sexual relations, which tend to actually increase just before deployment. So I'll give you a statistics, which an observation. I'll call it an observation which is true in the US and the British military. I've worked on it as a consultant, and I know that it will stimulate accusations of sexism to make this observation, but it's well documented. Just before deployment, pregnancies go up in the active component or activated component of the unit that is female, because sexual romantic relationships get active just before deployment. It could be as simple as personnel are coming together for their pre-deployment refresher training, and there's more opportunity for those relations. And also, it seems that some women avoid deployment by getting pregnant just before deployment. A single gender unit helps to cut down on those threats to cohesion. And then there are the physical standards of combat, particularly in infantry. I can imagine, for instance, women serving well or easier in the armored corps than I can in the infantry, but they still need to pass the same tests as the men. There are physical challenges that most people would fail serving a tank, such as carrying the ammunition, breaking track, taking out and replacing road wheels. I know some women are perfectly capable of that. And by the way, I have observed women working perfectly well in special operations. In some cases, they are acting effectively as operators, where mixed gender is actually an advantage, say in surveillance. I am not against women, as I've said, competing with men equally for the same roles, but they have to pass the same standards. And I don't want the standards lowered just for women in order to raise a quota, which is where the British military is going. By the way, the book I recommended to you, Made Not Born, Why Some Military Personnel Are Better Than Others, that goes back 20 years. I wrote that more than 20 years ago. So my position on gender neutrality in recruiting has gone back a long way. But remember, it's got to be meritorious. They've got to compete to the same standards. Britain's armed forces, like British police, they tend to overpromise on the capacity of women to take on physical roles. Then they lower the standards to keep women in. And here's a kicker that most people don't realize. When you lower the standards for women, you inevitably lower the standards for men too. because men get pissed off that women are getting away with lower standards. And so they have a retention problem. So how do you keep them? You lower the standards for them too, and everybody's standards are lowered. The quota, by the way, the quota for women in the British military was set at it was set in 2016 when David Cameron's administration opened all military roles to women. The plan was to get 15% of the armed forces to be women by 2020. In 2020, the proportion was actually 12%. In 2021, the MOD increased its quota. It calls it a target for female representation, but it's a quota from 15% to 30% of military personnel. 30%? Really? That's a bit ambitious, if you ask me. It's a proportion that the British police have already hit. And look how that's working out for the British police. A lot of embarrassing cases of where women cannot take down the men they're trying to arrest. We've already seen the negative results of this, although the government doesn't want to draw attention to them. Standards have been lowered for women, and then men get lower standards themselves, which is perverse. So both genders get lower standards. Right, relatedly, number 6, military personnel are fatter. Yes, they are. Too fat to fight. So when you get more contractualism, more wokery, less personal processing of or management of personnel, and more desperation to raise the proportion of foreigners and women, you're going to lower the standards for everybody. And physical fitness is illustrative of this. By 2019, British soldiers were posting those memes of obese women in uniform lecturing other soldiers on health. 1 in 4 military personnel were rated as too fat to fight in 2023 and 2025 this year. Shocking. And you wonder why a minority of military personnel are ready to deploy. They're just not fit enough. And this is a problem that's been going back a long way, by the way. It goes back to the 90s when I was recruited, when I was astounded by fat officers who were just, they were, what at the time they were called preferred candidates. I think that's right. They were called preferred candidates by the regiment. Some regiments, were prioritizing family relations and stuff like that over physical fitness, and these officers were getting away with it. Was just fat, and it was an embarrassment to the unit, and it obviously reflects poorly on the service as a whole. So we've had a 2-tier fatness problem in the military for decades, but it wasn't 1 in 4 being too fat to fight. All right, number 7, seventh problem here. The most motivated and skilled personnel are driven out of the military by woke messaging. Personnel are bombarded with warnings about raising your expectations too high. Sounds a lot like British schools and universities, worse at universities. Don't raise your expectations too high. You're putting too much pressure. It's too much pressure, too much stress on students in the schooling system and soldiers, military personnel. Don't use offensive national symbols. They may be offensive to some of your foreign soldiers. Like you fly the British flag in the British military, that might offend some of the British military personnel who are actually not British, they're foreign, and they have some totally unjustifiable reason to hate Britain while they serve Britain. Right. And so what I've heard, by the way, is that some mascot. So if a regiment has a dog as a mascot, like a greyhound or an Irish wolfhound, dogs could be considered offensive to Muslim personnel. So would you please get rid of those? If your battle honors include battles where the enemies were Muslim, try not to draw attention to that. That could be offensive. Obviously, avoid hurty words. Avoid hurting anybody's feelings. Gendered language. Gendered language that might assume that most personnel are male, which they are. that could be considered sexism. And unconscious biases, of course. By 2020, the MOD employed 44 DEI officers. The average across 20 departments sampled was 20. So the MOD, which actually isn't a particularly big department, has far too many DEI officers. One is too many. And DEI can set the standard not just within their own little bubble, but for the entire military to the very top of it. So just in October last month, the Deputy Chief of the General Staff wrote a letter to all the colonels of all the corps and regiments in the army, calling them to, quote, dissociate from clubs whose rules, policies, or cultural practices may not align with the army's commitment to inclusivity. And what was the provocation that he was responding to? He went to Boodle's Club in London, a gentleman's club, which has rooms for men only. It's not exclusively a club for a club that doesn't allow women into the building, but it has rooms that are for gentlemen only. A lot of clubs do, and that provoked him to write this letter. As if the colonels of all the corps and regiments should care about Boodle's gender discrimination. But he did actually. I'm going to add this. He wrote in the letter, the army's mission is to achieve, quote, positive change beyond the army. In fact, it's not just a mission; it's a strategic necessity. What? The army's strategic necessity is to change gender inequality in Boodle's Club in London, a private civilian club. Mm. So if you got this sort of messaging, this sort of wokery, if you're serving a military, it says the strategic necessity for the military is making civilian society more inclusive. Are you going to stick around for that? Is that sort of military tradition that you joined up for? Probably not if you're a high capacity person. So, what sort of personnel are you going to be left with? Overly emotional, self obsessed snowflakes who care more about identity politics than professionalism and merit. Yep. All right. Number 8, combat personnel are driven out of the military by the legal risks. I mentioned this earlier. So increasingly, personnel face civil and criminal prosecution for violating the human right to life, right? It's written into international law and European human rights, which are codified into British law. Even if they obey rules of engagement at the time, the military's rules of engagement, there can be a civilian prosecution for violating the human right to life, which they are not protected from by obeying military rules of engagement. Mm. And they can be prosecuted by the government's own authorities. So the government that employs them can also employ lawyers, which will prosecute personnel for the same thing. And you've got the additional problem that the British military might be deployed on an operation that they think is legitimate. It's been rated as lawful by the MOD's lawyers at the time, but retrospectively, the government might decide that it was unlawful. And then what? They're going to prosecute personnel who obeyed orders at the time. Obviously, this most of it's a greater problem for special operations personnel because they're deploying all the time. They are also engaged in domestic counterterrorism, which in the United States is not allowable under posse comitatus. But in Britain, special operators will counter terrorists armed in civilian clothes inside the borders of the United Kingdom and abroad, but they're allowed. This is the point: they're allowed to do it inside the United Kingdom, which US personnel are not. So it just adds to their tempo, and they could be chased by lawyers afterwards for doing what they were ordered to do. Armistice Day, which was last week in November, we're speaking in November, 9 4-star generals signed an open letter to warn the government that the legal activism surrounding Northern Ireland is, quote, weakening the moral foundations and operational effectiveness of the forces on which this nation depends. Um, blah, 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 blah. Today, every deployed member of the British Armed Forces must consider not only the enemy in front, but the lawyer behind. That's a pretty good line. That sums it up. So remember what I alluded to earlier. Who is most incentivized to quit the military if they are aware of these legal risks? Combatants. So it's combatants who are most likely, relative to non-combatants, to face these legal recriminations for denying somebody the human right to life. So that helps to explain why that there are more leavers than joiners in the military, and the military continues to shrink, and you're left with a lower quality residual personnel. So in summary, I like this line. This is not in the Substack, but this is how I've been led to summarize the findings here by discussions with other editors. The military ends up with fewer real personnel, meaning they are field personnel rather than the desk jockeys in the MOD and the civilian administrators. So fewer real personnel, more contractors, fewer inducted applicants, more wokesters, more foreigners, more females, more fatties, more snowflakes, and fewer combatants. It's a tragic situation, but I make myself laugh just reading that off.